A black businesswoman boards a first-class flight, expecting a peaceful journey home. But just minutes after takeoff, a flight attendant targets her without cause, humiliating her in front of the entire cabin. What happens next sets off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful content. It started as just another flight, but by the time the plane landed, the entire world would be watching. The airport smelled of burnt coffee, recycled air, and a kind of impatience that belonged to nowhere else but America. People moved in waves, some rushing, some waiting, all caught in the rhythm of travel, of departures and arrivals, of comings and goings that never quite seemed to settle. Elaine Foster sat quietly in the terminal, her ticket folded neatly between her fingers, a habit she'd developed over years of travel. She was used to flying, used to moving through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago that power, real power, was never about who you were, but about how well you could convince others that you belonged. She had spent her entire life convincing people. The white woman behind the counter barely glanced at her ticket before pressing her lips together. "Miss Foster," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar sharpness of forced politeness. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" Elaine blinked. She had checked in online. No baggage to claim. First-class ticket. There was no reason to stop her. But she stepped aside anyway. Because that's what you do when you are black and in a hurry. You make yourself small enough to slip through the cracks. A man in a navy blue suit approached the counter. White. Middle-aged. The kind of person who was never asked to step aside. The woman behind the counter straightened. Smiling now, her voice smoothing itself into something lighter, something easier. "Welcome aboard, sir. Enjoy your flight." Elaine exhaled slowly. She would wait, because waiting had become second nature to her. She had waited for promotions, for doors to open, for seats at tables that weren't built for her. She had waited for the country she had built her success in to decide she was worthy of its respect. And now, here she was, waiting to board a plane she had paid for, waiting to be seen, waiting to be given what was already hers. The woman behind the counter finally looked up, sighed, and waved her forward. "You can board now," she said. No apology, no acknowledgement, just permission. Elaine smiled, the kind of smile that was not for her, but for the world that was always watching, always testing her patience. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the weight of the sky pressing down on her, knowing that this flight was about to become more than just a journey. It was a test, and Elaine Foster was done waiting. Elaine stepped onto the plane, adjusting the strap of her handbag over her shoulder. The cabin smelled of leather and expensive perfume. A place where money bought comfort. Where first class meant something softer, something easier. But comfort, she had learned, was a currency not freely given to people who looked like her. She found her seat. 4A. A window seat. First class. A small luxury she had learned to afford herself after years of making do with less. As she reached up to place her bag in the overhead compartment, she caught the subtle shift in the energy around her. It was in the way the man in 4B, a white man in a crisp business suit, paused as he adjusted his tie. The way his eyes flickered up, then back down to his newspaper as if she were a noise rather than a person. It was in the way the flight attendant, a tall, blonde woman with a perfect smile, hesitated for just a fraction of a second before greeting her. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice just a shade too cool. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Elaine met her gaze. Steady. "Yes. 4A. The flight attendant didn't look at the ticket in her hand. She didn't need to. The question had never been about the seat. A polite nod. An almost imperceptible flicker of disappointment. And then she turned to help another passenger. This time with warmth. With ease. Elaine settled in, exhaling slowly, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had been here before. In rooms where she wasn't expected. At tables where her presence required explanation. She didn't have to turn her head to know that 4B was watching her now. "You must work for someone important," the man said, folding his newspaper with slow precision. Elaine turned to look at him. taking in his neatly trimmed mustache, the expensive watch that glinted against his wrist. I do, she said, offering nothing more. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried weight, that held assumptions in the space between words. That's nice, he said. Good to see opportunities opening up these days. She let the words hang there, heavy, unspoken things filling the space between them. Opportunities, as if the seat she had paid for had been gifted to her. As if success, when worn on her skin, was a kindness rather than a right. The flight attendant returned, offering warm towels to the first-class passengers. She handed one to 4B with a smile, then hesitated before giving one to Elaine, as if remembering herself at the last moment. Enjoy your flight, the attendant said, but the words felt rehearsed, practiced in a way that suggested they weren't meant for her at all. Elaine took the towel, pressing it against her fingers, letting the heat sink in. She looked out the window, watching the tarmac below. The plane had yet to leave the ground, and already, she felt the weight of the journey ahead. The plane had been in the air for 40 minutes when the first real disruption came. Elaine had settled in, flipping through a book she had brought along for the trip. She was used to the quiet weight of judgment that came with occupying spaces where people like her were not expected. It was an old, familiar presence, like the hum of an air conditioner in the background. You learn to live with it, to ignore it, even as it pressed against you. The flight attendant returned to take drink orders, moving effortlessly through first class, her smile bright and polished. She leaned toward 4B, her voice warm and attentive. And for you, sir? I'll take a bourbon. Neat. Of course. The flight attendant turned to Elaine, her smile dimming ever so slightly. A shift too small to be called anything but unmistakable. And you, ma'am? Elaine glanced up from her book. A glass of red wine. Please. The attendant hesitated, then gave a tight-lipped smile. I'll have to check if we have that available. Elaine said nothing, only nodded. She watched as the attendant walked away, stopping at the next row. Red wine for you? She heard the attendant ask another passenger. Her tone effortlessly accommodating. Elaine inhaled through her nose, letting the moment settle inside her. A small thing but not a small thing at all. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned with 4B's bourbon, setting it down with a gracious nod. Then she turned to Elaine, her expression unreadable. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're out of red wine. Elaine glanced over her shoulder toward the galley where she had seen a bottle of Merlot being poured just moments ago. Out, she repeated, her voice even. Yes, ma'am. There were choices in moments like this. You could ask the question directly, demand an answer you already knew. Or you could sit back and let the truth reveal itself in its own time. Elaine offered a small, polite smile. That's unfortunate. The attendant gave a perfunctory nod and walked away. Elaine looked at the man in 4B, who had been watching the exchange over the rim of his glass. Guess you should have asked first, he said, smirking. She turned back to her book, refusing to let the moment take root inside her. But that was the thing about moments like these. They always did. 20 minutes passed before the second disruption came. Elaine had tucked herself further into her book, willing herself into its pages. But the world had a way of pulling her back. A man from the coach had wandered into first class. Tall, white, young, the kind of confidence in his step that suggested he had never had to question whether or not he belonged. He was dressed well but not well enough. His ticket was in his hand, held loosely at his side. A quiet admission of his mistake. The flight attendant intercepted him, her voice sharp but professional. Sir, this section is for first-class passengers only. Oh, he said, stopping mid-step. I just, quote, please return to your seat. He hesitated, but only for a second. Right. Sorry about that. The attendant watched as he turned and walked back toward coach. The entire interaction lasted no more than 10 seconds. Then, she turned toward Elaine. Ma'am, she said, her voice now lower, heavier. Can I see your ticket? Elaine blinked. There it was. The moment when doubt had turned inward. When judgment had become action. Elaine tilted her head slightly, meeting the woman's gaze. I beg your pardon? Your ticket, ma'am. Just for verification. Elaine set down her book, exhaling slowly through her nose. You've already seen my ticket, she said. The attendant smiled, but there was something taut in her expression. Something strained. It's just a routine check. Elaine let the silence stretch between them, heavy and unrelenting. Then, she reached into her bag, pulled out the slip of paper, and held it up between two fingers. The flight attendant took it, glancing at it as if she expected to find something wrong. When she didn't, she gave a tight nod, handing it back. Thank you, ma'am. Elaine took the ticket and placed it back in her bag, her fingers curling around the strap. The flight attendant walked away, and Elaine let her eyes drift to 4B. He was watching again, but this time, he said nothing. He only sipped his bourbon and looked away. Elaine turned back to the window, the night sky stretching out before her, endless and dark. The plane had 30 minutes left in the air, and she had never felt more like a passenger. The plane droned on through the night, the quiet hum of the engines filling the cabin with a steady rhythm. The air inside was thick, not with noise, but with something heavier, something unspoken, the kind of weight that settled between people who pretended not to see what was in front of them. Elaine sat still, her hands resting on the hardcover book in her lap. Though she was no longer reading, she had thought about ordering something else to drink. But she wasn't interested in another excuse. Another moment of selective service disguised as professionalism. No, she had seen enough for tonight. The man in 4B, the one who had been watching her since the flight began, shifted slightly in his seat. He wasn't reading, wasn't sleeping, he was just watching. He wasn't hostile, not exactly, but there was something in the way his eyes lingered that told her he was waiting for something. Perhaps for her to react. To let the heat of all these little humiliations rise to the surface. But she wouldn't. Not yet. The flight attendant, Sophia, Elaine remembered, had long since disappeared into the galley. The same woman who had asked for her ticket after letting a white man from the coach wander freely through the cabin. The same woman who had run out of red wine after pouring it for other passengers. The same woman who had made herself the silent enforcer of an old, unspoken rule. Elaine let out a quiet breath, turning her gaze toward the window. The night sky stretched out like ink, broken only by the distant glow of a city far below. And then, the third disruption came. It was small at first. Just a shift in movement at the front of the cabin. A conversation between a different flight attendant and a man in a well-tailored suit. Elaine didn't think much of it. Not at first. But something about the way Sophia reappeared made her take notice. She walked with purpose this time, cutting through the aisle like she had a job to do. And her job, it seemed, was Elaine. Ma'am, she said, her voice crisp and formal. I need to speak with you. Elaine turned her gaze upward, her expression steady. Yes? There's been a complaint, Sophia continued, her tone light but firm, as if she were trying to make this sound like nothing at all. A passenger has expressed concern about your presence in this section. Elaine blinked slowly, her face betraying no surprise. My presence? She repeated. Sophia hesitated, but only for a second. They're uncomfortable, she clarified. I'll have to ask you to switch seats. There it was. Elaine took a slow breath, letting the words settle in the space between them. I see, she said, closing her book. She glanced around, noting the subtle shift in the cabin. The way a few people had suddenly found their magazines very interesting. The way others pretended not to hear. The way 4B, silent observer that he was, watched even more intently now, his bourbon glass resting lightly in his palm. Elaine folded her hands in her lap. And which passenger would that be? She asked. Sophia's lips pressed together. I can't disclose that information. Elaine nodded, as if considering. Then, she leaned in just slightly. But you can disclose this. Can't you? That I am a paying customer. Sitting in the seat I purchased. In the section I am entitled to sit in. Sophia's mouth opened, but no words came. Elaine didn't let the silence stretch too long. I see, she said again. This time, the words were heavier. The man in 4B shifted in his seat. But he still said nothing. Elaine exhaled softly and tilted her head. Let me ask you something. Miss? She deliberately let the question hang. Sophia, the attendant supplied, her voice tight. Sophia. Elaine let the name roll off her tongue. If I were someone else. If I were, say, him. She nodded toward 4B. Would this conversation be happening? Sophia's jaw tensed. Ma'am. Or is it just me? Elaine continued, her voice quiet but sharp. Is it just me who makes people uncomfortable? The silence in the cabin deepened. Sophia shifted her weight slightly. The discomfort now hers to carry. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, as if seeking support, but none came. Elaine took another slow breath. Her hands were steady on the book in her lap. You'll have to excuse me, she said, her voice silk smooth. I don't believe I'll be moving tonight. A flicker of something passed over Sophia's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or something sharper, but she said nothing. Instead, she gave a short, tight nod and turned, walking briskly back toward the galley. Elaine watched her go. The weight of the moment sat heavy in the air, pressing down on the cabin like a second layer of atmosphere. She could feel the silent calculations happening around her, the unspoken thoughts hanging in the air. And then, for the first time that night, 4B spoke. That was impressive, he said, swirling his bourbon. Elaine turned to him, her expression unreadable. You were waiting, she observed. He smirked slightly, sipping his drink. I like to see how things play out. Elaine tilted her head. And what did you see? He studied her for a moment, then shrugged. I saw someone who's good at picking her battles. She considered that, her gaze drifting toward the front of the plane. Maybe, she said, or maybe I just know when the battle's already started. 4B chuckled. Touché. Elaine turned back toward the window. The city below was gone now, swallowed by darkness. The plane carried on, but the night was not done with her yet. She knew that much. The hum of the plane had become an afterthought, blending into the thick silence that stretched between the passengers. A silence not of peace, but of something sharper, an unspoken agreement among strangers that they had all just witnessed something but had no obligation to acknowledge it. Elaine had expected that. She had seen how silence operated, how it slid into rooms and curled up in the corners of conversations, how it protected the people who wished to pretend that nothing had happened. She also knew that silence could be weaponized. The flight attendant, Sophia, had not returned since her failed attempt to have Elaine removed. That, too, was predictable. Elaine had not raised her voice, had not threatened, had not given them any justification for the kind of removal they wanted. She had simply refused. That was the most dangerous thing a black woman could do. Say no and mean it. And now, the punishment has begun. It started small. The overhead air vent above her seat, which she had adjusted earlier, now blew with an unnatural intensity. An icy stream of air pressing against her skin. When she tried to twist it closed, it wouldn't budge, frozen in place. Next, the service cart. When it rolled down the aisle again, stopping at every row, offering wine, snacks, coffee, warmth, and conversation. It stopped before it reached her. And then it moved past her without pause. Like she was not there at all. The woman seated across the aisle, an older lady in pearls and a navy cardigan, gave a small frown, a flicker of hesitation. Her gaze met Elaine's for half a second before she quickly turned away, choosing her own comfort over confrontation. That was how it worked. Elaine could feel herself being erased in real time, reduced from a paying customer to an inconvenience. They wouldn't ask her to leave again. Not outright. Instead, they would make her presence unbearable. They would starve her of service, of comfort, of even the basic recognition of her humanity. She had seen this before. She had been a little girl once, sitting at a department store counter with her mother, waiting to be acknowledged as the saleswoman attended to every white customer first. She had been a college student, standing in line at a cafe while the barista took the orders of the people behind her first, pretending not to see her. She had been a professional woman, reaching for a taxi only to watch it pull away the moment her hand lifted. Now, she was a woman on a plane, dressed well, educated, financially secure, and yet, none of it changed a thing. She was still black in a white space. And now, she was being erased. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, across the aisle. 4B. The man who had been watching her since takeoff let out a soft chuckle. Interesting, he murmured, swirling the last of his bourbon. Elaine turned her head slightly. What's that? He gestured vaguely toward the front of the cabin, where Sophia had disappeared. How they handle things. How quickly they decide who matters and who doesn't. Elaine studied him. And what do you decide? He smirked, tilting his head. Oh, I already know who matters. She let the words hang between them, unsure if they were meant as a compliment or an insult. The man in 4B was an observer. A man who noticed the game but never had to play it. He could afford to watch. To find amusement in the way power was distributed. Because it never threatened him. Elaine turned back toward the window, watching as the horizon stretched endlessly before them. Then, suddenly, a new shift. A presence. Not Sophia. Not 4B. But another flight attendant. A man this time. Daniel. She felt him before she saw him. Hovering at the edge of her row. Waiting for her to acknowledge him. When she finally turned, he offered a smile. Polite but strained. Miss. He said carefully. Would you like a complimentary drink? Elaine studied him for a long moment. She knew this game, too. The company had sent a different face. A different voice. A carefully selected emissary to undo what Sophia had done without an apology. Without an admission. Without accountability. A quiet correction. No, thank you, Elaine said smoothly. Daniel hesitated, but only briefly. Then, with a small nod, he retreated. Elaine exhaled, pressing her fingers against the hardcover book in her lap. They were trying to decide what to do with her. They had failed to intimidate her. They had failed to remove her. And now, they were recalculating. She could feel it. The plane continued on, steady and unbothered, while the weight of unspoken rules shifted around her. Somewhere, in the unseen spaces of the flight crew's conversations, someone was asking, how do we make her disappear completely? Elaine sat still. She had mastered that skill long ago. She had learned, through experience, that when you are black in a white space, your stillness becomes your shield. If you move too much, you're a threat. If you speak too loudly, you're angry. If you demand what is rightfully yours, you're difficult. So, she sat still. But stillness was not the same as surrender. The plane continued to hum, pressing forward through the night sky. Around her, conversations flicker like candle flames. Soft, warm, and utterly detached from the thing that was happening right in front of them. The flight attendant, Sophia, had vanished. She had not returned to Elaine's row since she spilled that coffee. Since she left her soaked and burning. Since she made it clear exactly where Elaine stood in the hierarchy of this flight. And that was the truth. Wasn't it? She was meant to stay in her place. She had refused. And now, she was being punished. Not openly. There was no shouting, no confrontation. No one had grabbed her, forced her out of her seat, demanded she leave the plane. Instead, they were doing something worse. They were erasing her. She was invisible. Elaine lifted her chin slightly, scanning the cabin. The woman across the aisle, the one who had given her a flicker of concern earlier, now stared straight ahead, stiff as marble. The man in 4B, the one who had observed it all with mild amusement, was flipping through a newspaper, as if none of this mattered. The passengers around her went on, drinking their wine, flipping through their magazines, tapping on their phones. It was as if an entire silent agreement had been made. And she was the only one who had not signed it. Elaine thought about something her father once told her. White people don't always need words to make their point. Sometimes, silence is just as deadly. She understood that now. Because it wasn't just the absence of speech. It was the deliberate withholding of recognition. It was a kind of violence that left no bruises, no scars, but buried itself in the skin all the same. And then, as if on cue, another shift. This time, it was Rebecca, the senior flight attendant. She walked down the aisle with a practiced, effortless grace, stopping at Elaine's row with a tight, professional smile. Ma'am, she said, in the kind of voice that people use when they are pretending to be polite but are already convinced of their own authority. Would you like to step to the back with me for a moment? Elaine tilted her head slightly. She knew what was happening. This was the next step. First, They ignored her. Then, they tried to appease her. Now, they were offering her a private conversation. A chance to resolve this quietly. Away from the watching eyes of the other passengers. Why? Elaine asked. Her voice steady. Rebecca's smile did not falter. But a flicker of irritation passed through her eyes. I'd just like to have a word with you. Elaine folded her hands in her lap. No, thank you, she said. Rebecca blinked, momentarily thrown off. Excuse me? I said no, thank you, Elaine repeated, slower this time. Rebecca's smile tightened, the edges of it curling like paper near a flame. Ma'am, I really must insist. Quote. And I must decline. A pause. A shift. Elaine could feel it, the quick recalculations happening behind Rebecca's eyes. The slight panic of someone realizing that the script she was following no longer applied. The cabin had gone still. People weren't watching, not openly, but she could feel their attention. The way their bodies subtly tensed. The way their ears leaned just slightly toward the conversation. Elaine exhaled, slow and steady. You want to talk to me? She said. Her voice barely above a whisper. Do it right here. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Elaine was supposed to comply. She was supposed to step away. To make it easier for them to handle her. To remove her from sight. She was supposed to make herself small. Instead, she was forcing them to handle her publicly. Rebecca glanced around, as if seeking backup, but none came. The moment stretched. Then, finally, she exhaled through her nose, as if dismissing something insignificant, and walked away without another word. Elaine turned back toward the window, the cold air from the overhead vent still pressing against her skin. They weren't done with her. She knew that. They would not let her win so easily. But she had made them take a step back. And sometimes, that was enough. For now, Elaine knew this was the moment where things could tip. She could feel it in the way the air in the cabin had thickened. The way the silence stretched just a little too long after the flight attendant walked away. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full. Full of judgment, of calculation, of a collective decision being made. She had refused to comply. And now, they would decide what to do with her. She turned her head slightly, scanning the rows of passengers without moving too much. Without making it obvious, she had learned, long ago, that even the smallest action, a raised voice, a sudden gesture, could be turned against you when you were black in a white space. The woman across the aisle still stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. The man in 4B had lowered his newspaper, just enough to watch. Others stole glances from behind their glasses, from beneath their lowered lids. They were waiting, not for justice, not for fairness, but for confirmation that the world still worked the way they had always believed it did. And then, the next step arrived. This time, it wasn't a single flight attendant. It was two. Rebecca returned, but now she was joined by Daniel, one of the male attendants. Taller, broader, with the kind of presence that made it clear why he had been chosen for this. Elaine didn't move. She kept her breathing slow, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Ma'am, Rebecca said again, her voice thinner now, stretched tight over something sharp. We need you to come with us. Elaine exhaled through her nose. She could hear it now. The shift in we need you versus would you like to step to the back. The performance of politeness was slipping. She glanced at Daniel, who stood just slightly behind Rebecca, hands clasped in front of him. But his stance was rigid. Ready. This was no longer a request. What is the issue? Elaine asked, her voice still even, still composed. Rebecca didn't blink. We've received multiple complaints from other passengers. You're making them uncomfortable. Elaine tilted her head slightly, as if considering this. Uncomfortable, she repeated. How? Rebecca hesitated. Elaine saw it. That flicker, that hesitation before a lie. Before the script had been fully decided. You've been disruptive, Rebecca said finally. You've been speaking aggressively to the crew. Passengers have expressed concern. Elaine let the words settle between them. As heavy and ridiculous as they were. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now. Watching, waiting to see how she would react. Would she raise her voice? Would she argue? Would she give them what they wanted? A reason to confirm what they had already decided she was? Elaine didn't move. Rebecca, she said, her voice low and deliberate. Are you saying that asking for a glass of water is disruptive? Rebecca's jaw tightened. You refused to cooperate when I asked you to step to the back of the plane. You mean, when you asked me to disappear? Silence. Rebecca's nostrils flared slightly, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. Daniel shifted, clearing his throat. We're not going to argue about this. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Elaine took a slow breath, turned her head slightly, just enough to let her gaze pass over the other passengers. No one spoke. No one defended her. Even the woman across the aisle, the one who had looked concerned earlier, now stared at her lap, fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress. This was how it worked. This was the cycle. They push. You resist. They escalate. Elaine knew that if she stood now, if she complied, it wouldn't end here. They would walk her to the back of the plane. They would isolate her. They would make sure she understood that she had no power here. And if she refused, they would make her into a threat. They would turn her into the very thing they had already decided she was. Elaine inhaled. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned back in her seat. I'm fine right here, she said. Daniel's jaw clenched. Rebecca's expression flickered. First frustration, then something sharper. And then, as if on cue, they played the final card. Ma'am, Rebecca said, her voice harder now, stripped of all pretense. If you don't comply, we will have to call security when we land. Elaine exhaled. There it was. She had known this was coming. Had felt it in the air from the moment that coffee was spilled onto her skin. Now, she was no longer just a passenger. She was a problem to be handled. A threat to be removed. She thought of her father again. Of the way he had once told her about the first time he had been arrested. He had been younger than she was now. Barely more than a boy. And his crime had been walking home too late. In a neighborhood where his presence was deemed suspicious. They don't need a real reason. He had told her. All they need is the right kind of silence. And enough people willing to believe it. Elaine exhaled through her nose. And then, finally, she turned her gaze fully to Rebecca. Calm. Unshaken. Then call them. A flicker of surprise passed through Rebecca's eyes. Just for a moment. Daniel shifted. Clearly unsettled. Elaine knew why. She wasn't playing her part. She wasn't begging. Wasn't raising her voice. Wasn't giving them a reason. She was simply refusing. And sometimes, refusal was the most powerful thing you could do. The tension in the air sharpened. Thickened. And for the first time, Elaine saw something in Rebecca's face that looked like doubt. Because now, it was their move. And everyone was watching. Elaine sat still. She had learned, long ago, that silence could be a weapon. It was the kind of silence that made men in suits shift uncomfortably in their chairs. That made police officers rest their hands on their belts. That made flight attendants hesitate before making the final decision. The plane was still in the air. But they were already deciding what would happen when it landed. She knew the script. She had seen it before. Lived it before. The words non-compliant passenger would be used. The phrase escalated the situation would be in the report. And, most damning of all, someone would say, I felt unsafe. That was always the one that sealed it. Because her safety, her dignity, her comfort, her basic right to exist in a space, was never part of the equation. Elaine turned her head slightly. Rebecca was still standing there. Her expression tight, her lips pressed together as if willing herself not to speak first. Daniel, the male attendant, stood a little further back. Hands still clasped, posture still stiff, as if waiting for a signal that he should act. And the passengers? They were waiting, too. They weren't looking at her anymore. Not directly. But they were listening. Waiting for her to raise her voice. Waiting for her to prove them right. Elaine exhaled through her nose. And then, slowly, so very slowly, she unfolded her hands and reached for her bag beneath the seat. Rebecca flinched. It was so small. The movement. So quick. So unconscious. And yet, it told Elaine everything she needed to know. They weren't just waiting for her to raise her voice. They were waiting for her to make the wrong move. She kept her voice steady. I need my phone. Rebecca's eyes flickered to Daniel, as if silently confirming, should we allow this? It was absurd, really, the way a simple action, a request, a movement, a shift of weight, was measured against the possibility of danger. Elaine saw it happening in real time. The unspoken, unacknowledged rule of spaces like this. A white woman's discomfort could outweigh a black woman's reality. A white man's convenience could be more valuable than a black woman's dignity. The world had been built this way. And everyone, whether they admitted it or not, knew how to play their part. But today, Elaine refused. She retrieved her phone. No sudden movements. No unnecessary words. And she turned on her camera. The quiet gasp from somewhere in the cabin was almost laughable. Elaine didn't need to turn around to know who had made it. The passengers weren't looking at her before. But now? Now, they were. Now, the script has changed. Because now, there was evidence. Now, there was something more powerful than their words. More powerful than their selective memories. And Elaine knew, that this was the moment everything could shift. Because nothing frightened people more than the truth being recorded. Rebecca cleared her throat. Ma'am, filming other passengers is against airline policy. Elaine tilted her head. Calm, steady. Then I'll only record myself. She turned the phone so that the screen faced her, ensuring that her own image was centered. That her voice was clear. She kept her tone measured. Deliberate. My name is Elaine Carter. I am a passenger on this flight. I have not raised my voice. I have not caused a disturbance. I have only asked for the same service that every other passenger has received. She paused, just for a second. Then, I am being targeted. Silence. Rebecca's face paled. Daniel stiffened. And then, finally, a voice from the back. She's right. Elaine turned, just slightly. The older woman from earlier. The one who had clutched her purse so tightly, as if debating whether or not to get involved, was sitting up straight now. She wasn't looking at Elaine, but at Rebecca. I've been watching. She hasn't done anything wrong. A ripple of movement passed through the cabin. Another voice. A man. This time, I don't know what's going on. But if someone's uncomfortable, it's not because of her. Rebecca faltered. Daniel's jaw clenched. Elaine said nothing. She didn't have to. She had witnesses. She had proof. And suddenly, for the first time since this had all begun, Rebecca looked uncertain. Because now, it wasn't just about a passenger who wouldn't comply. Now, it was about the airline. Now, it was about who would be held accountable. Rebecca inhaled sharply through her nose. And then, with the same forced politeness she had started with, she took a step back. Enjoy the rest of your flight. Ma'am. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement. But it was a retreat. Elaine watched her go. Watched the way she stiffened as she turned on her heel and stalked toward the front of the cabin. Daniel lingered for half a second longer. Then, without a word, he followed. Elaine exhaled. And then, slowly, she lowered her phone. The woman across the aisle still wouldn't meet her gaze. But the older woman who had spoken up, she gave Elaine the smallest nod. Elaine returned it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Because they both understood. The plane was still in the air. The world was still the same. And yet, something had changed. Maybe not enough. Maybe not yet. But enough to remind Elaine of the weight of silence? It could be broken. And sometimes, all it took was a single voice.